Hey everybody, Justin Morton here again, your instructor for Intro to World Religions. First video is really not going to be about Hinduism per se. It's going to be setting up some of the key terms for discussing Hinduism. What I really want to do is define three terms, the one distinction between two things, so defining both of those terms, and then defining an extra term. Okay, so I'm not going to write this down. I expect y'all, this is going to be one more background note before we get started. With really complicated stuff, I might put it up on a PowerPoint or up on the whiteboard function on Blackboard Collaborate. But I'm going to be expecting y'all, I'm going to lecture, quote unquote, as if I'm in class. I expect y'all to be taking notes, to be paying close attention as you would be in class. Okay, so this first video is going to be defining monotheism versus polytheism. Some of y'all are aware of this distinction. We're not going to really nuance it at all. We're going to move through pretty quickly. And then define a philosophical position which Hinduism is committed to called monism. Okay, so don't get this mixed up with monotheism. They sound a lot alike. Monism is very different than monotheism. Christianity, for example, Judaism, Islam are all monotheistic, but not monistic. Okay, so here's the distinction. I'm not going to be writing this down. I think these are pretty simple definitions. And of course, this is going to be better for you in terms of note taking than being in a normal class because you can rewind and pause and things like that. So monotheism is the claim that there is only one God. Okay. And polytheism is generally the claim that there are more than one God. There's more than one God. That's how you should have it, and that's what you'll be tested on. Let's talk a little bit about this and try to get a little bit deeper. It's going to depend a little bit on how we define the term God, right? And we mean God with a little g, right? Not for those of us who come from a Jewish or a Christian background, not God with the big G, that's a proper name. But what is a God? What is a deity? That's a hard question because on certain ways, if you define it in such a way that it's just a supernatural being that has extra human power and ability and things like that, then Christianity, for example, turns out to be polytheistic because there are these things called angels and these things called demons. And those things are supernatural, non-physical beings that have superhuman powers going beyond what humans at least currently have. So it can't just be that unless we want Christianity to come out polytheistic. But Christianity is supposed to be monotheistic. So it has to be that what a God is something more than just a non-physical, supernatural being with superhuman powers, right? Because that definition allows like invisible superheroes to count as gods. So it must be something like that definition plus it's an object of worship, or a proper object of worship or something like that, right? So we can't define gods as being something that are supremely objects of worship, right? If you say that, what you're saying is that thing deserves worship above all else. But then it sounds like that's just going to commit you to, in virtue of defining the definition of the word God, you'll be committed to monotheism, right? Unless there can be ties among the things that are supremely deserving of worship. So I think God here is going to mean something like supernatural being. I actually don't think we should say that it has to be non-physical. The Greek gods were not non-physical, but they were still gods, according to the Greeks. According to Mormons, God is a physical being in some sense. There's a lot of nuance to that claim when they make it. And according to other religions, gods, especially indigenous religions, gods are physical beings. So I don't think that being non-physical is essential to the notion of being a god. Maybe just a supernatural being that is deserving of human worship or something like that, or maybe just deserving of worship. And if you define it that way, then I think our monotheism versus polytheism gets the right sort of results, so to speak. Christianity would come out as monotheistic, because there's only one God there's only one supernatural being who's deserving of worship. We're not supposed to worship angels or demons, according to Christianity, and similarly for Judaism, similarly for Islam, I believe. Okay, so pretty simple distinction there. Monotheism, there's only one God. Polytheism, there are multiple gods. So there are multiple. If you're a polytheist, you think there are multiple supernatural beings deserving of human worship or of worship in general. Okay, so that's that distinction. Now, monism, like I said, sounds a lot like monotheism. Distinct claim. But monism does not have anything essentially to do with religion at all. It could be a purely philosophical position. But it is the claim that reality is fundamentally one or unified. Or to put it differently, reality is there's fundamentally no distinction in reality. That all apparent distinctions or multiplicity are illusions. So, for example, let's put some flesh on the bones here and give some examples. It looks like there are multiple people in the world, right? Like 7 billion of them or something at this point. I don't know how many exactly. But if you're a monist, you have to say that's not true. There's at most one person, if there are any people at all, because there's no division within reality. Everything is one or unified. Seems like there's multiple cars on the street in front of me. I'm looking out the front window on my house. There's not. There's at most one car. There may not be cars at all, but at most there's one. So there's no two-ness, right? That's kind of one of the catchphrases here, at least according to the Hindu version of monism. There's not two-ness in the world, right? There may be zero of something that we think there are lots of, but there's at most one, right? So for any things in the world, there's at most one, but possibly zero of them, right? Okay, so this also commits you to other strange, interesting claims, or at least strange to Western ears usually. Suppose that you exist. Suppose that the world exists. If monism is true, then you are somehow identical with the world. Because if you exist and the world exists, but there's no two things in the world, then you and the world have to be the same thing. And similarly for the gods, if the gods exist, they must ultimately be one, and those things must ultimately be one with you. Right? If there's only one thing, then if you exist and the gods exist, you're the same thing. Now, there was a big if on the front of that. You might think that, yes, if I exist and if the world exists, but I think that selves don't actually exist. The self is an illusion. And there are people who claim this, and people within the Hindu tradition who claim this. And so I don't have to claim that I'm identical with the world, because I think that myself is ultimately an illusion. It doesn't really exist. Okay, so that's monism. We've put a little flesh on it. We've worked out some of its entailments. Some of those are conditional entailments. If you think that I exist and you think that the world exists, then we must be identical. That doesn't mean that I'm identical with the world. It means if I exist and if the world exists, I am. But maybe I don't exist at all. Maybe myself is an illusion. Okay, that is monism. What would be the opposite of monism, just for the sake of defining it? You could call it pluralism. There's more than one thing in the world. And that would allow for the existence of multiple gods that don't ultimately merge into each other, that aren't ultimately, their multiplicity isn't ultimately an illusion. It would allow for multiple people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, here in, America and the Western world, monism is a very, very, very rare view. And most of you are probably, I would put money on it, statistically speaking, pluralists. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here. We've got some definitions that we need.